Discover the Path Within with the 11 Journeys booklet.
Chapter 1. The Whisper of Stillness. Once upon a time, in a bustling world filled with hurried footsteps and the hum of endless noise, there lived a humble storyteller named Alan. Alan was neither famous nor rich, but he possessed something far more valuable, a deep understanding of stillness. One quiet evening, as the golden rays of the setting sun painted the skies with hues of amber and rose, Alan sat beneath an ancient cherry tree. Its blossoms swayed gently in the breeze, scattering delicate petals like whispers of forgotten wisdom. He gazed at the world around him, children laughing in the distance, leaves rustling in secret conversations, and the rhythm of life unfolding as if choreographed by an unseen hand. Alan smiled. In the rush to move forward, we often miss the beauty of the present, he murmured to himself. His words were soft, but they carried the weight of truth. He turned to the small crowd of villagers who had gathered, drawn by his quiet presence. "Let me tell you a story," Alan said, his voice as gentle as the wind. "A story about the power of slowing down." The villagers leaned in, their curiosity piqued. "There was once a traveler," Alan began, "who roamed far and wide in search of happiness. He climbed mountains, crossed deserts, and sailed across endless seas, believing that happiness was hidden in some distant land. But no matter where he went, he always felt a hollow ache within his heart. One day, exhausted from his journey, he sat by a calm river. As he watched the water flow, he noticed how the river moved effortlessly, carving its path without resistance. In its stillness, he saw the reflection of the sky, the trees, and even his own face. In that moment, the traveler realized something profound. Happiness was not something to chase. It was already here, in the quiet moments he had overlooked. It was in the way the river flowed, in the warmth of the sun on his skin, and in the simple act of breathing. And so, the traveler stopped running. He learned to sit with himself, to listen to the whispers of his own heart. Slowly, the ache within him dissolved, replaced by a sense of peace he had never known before. Alan paused, letting the story settle into the hearts of his listeners. The villagers sat in silence, the weight of their own hurried lives beginning to lift. "Perhaps," Alan said softly, "we are all like that traveler, searching for what is already within us. Perhaps the secret is not to do more, but to be more present." The cherry tree swayed gently, as if agreeing with his words, and for a moment the world seemed to slow down, allowing the villagers to bask in the quiet magic of the now. Chapter 2. Listening to the Invisible. Villagers, accustomed to their daily routines of toil and haste, found themselves slowing down, lingering longer under the shade of the cherry tree where Alan often sat. One cloudy afternoon, as raindrops began to paint the earth in delicate patterns, a young woman named Mira approached Alan. Mira was known for her restless energy. Her days were filled with tasks and lists, her nights consumed by thoughts of what she had yet to accomplish. She stood before Alan, her face shadowed with weariness. "Alan," she began hesitantly, "I've heard your stories, and they stir something within me. But I don't know how to stop. My mind races even when I try to rest. How do I hear the stillness you speak of?" Alan looked at Mira with a warm smile. "Come," he said, gesturing toward a small clearing in the forest nearby. Together, they walked until the sounds of the village faded into the soft hum of nature. The rain had stopped, and the air was alive with the scent of wet earth. "Do you hear that?" Alan asked, his voice low and calm. Mira tilted her head, listening. "I hear the wind," she said after a moment, "and the birds singing somewhere far away." Alan nodded. "Good. But listen closer. What else do you hear?" Mira frowned, straining her ears. "The rustling of leaves, the distant murmur of the river." "Now," Alan said, his eyes twinkling, "listen deeper. Not just with your ears, but with your whole being. Listen to what cannot be heard, but can still be felt." Mira closed her eyes, unsure of what he meant. She stood still, her thoughts struggling to quiet. But as the moments stretched on, she began to notice something. Beneath the sounds of the forest, there was a kind of silence, a presence that was both vast and intimate, as if the world itself was breathing. Her eyes flew open, and she looked at Alan in awe. I felt something," she whispered. "It was as if everything around me was alive, connected, and waiting for me to notice." Alan smiled. "That is the invisible rhythm of life, Mira. It's always there, but we are often too busy to hear it. When we slow down, we tune into the unspoken language of the world. It's in the silence between words, the spaces between moments. That is where peace resides." Mira felt a tear slip down her cheek, though she didn't know why. For the first time in years, her chest felt lighter, as if she had set down a burden she hadn't realized she was carrying. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. Alan nodded gently. "Remember, the silence will always be there. All you need to do is listen." As they walked back to the village, Mira felt as though the world had shifted ever so slightly. The wind seemed gentler, the colors more vibrant, and her own breath deeper. The invisible rhythm of life was no longer a mystery. It was a part of her, waiting to guide her whenever she chose to slow down and listen. Chapter 3. The Weight of Tomorrow. A week after Mira's quiet revelation, a man named Karun arrived at the cherry tree. Karun was a merchant, always moving, always planning. His thoughts were like a crowded marketplace, loud, restless, and driven by the urgency of tomorrow. He carried his worry as visibly as the satchel slung across his back, its weight tugging at his shoulders. "Alan," Karun said, sitting down heavily beside the storyteller, "your tales have reached even me. But tell me this, how do you live without being consumed by the future? My mind is always leaping ahead, worrying about what might come. If I don't plan every step, how will I succeed?" Alan studied Karan for a moment, then reached into his own small bag and pulled out a handful of seeds. "Let me show you something," he said. They walked to the edge of the village, where a small patch of earth lay untouched. Alan knelt down, his movements slow and deliberate, and began to press the seeds into the soil. Karun watched, puzzled. "What are you doing?" he asked. "I'm planting these seeds," Alan replied. "They will grow into flowers in time. But for now, all I can do is tend to them, water them, give them sunlight, and wait." Karun frowned. "But how can you be sure they'll grow? What if the rain doesn't come, or pests destroy them? Isn't it risky to rely on something so uncertain?" Alan looked up, his hands still covered in dirt. "That's the nature of life, Karan. We plant seeds without knowing the outcome. We can prepare the soil, nurture what we've planted, but we cannot control the future. Worrying about what might happen only robs us of the chance to enjoy what is happening now." Karun shook his head, unconvinced. "But what if the flowers never bloom? What if my plans fail?" Alan stood, brushing the soil from his hands. "If the flowers don't bloom, then we try again. But if we spend all our time fearing the future, we'll miss the beauty of watching the seeds grow, the joy of seeing the first sprout break through the earth." Life is not just about the destination, Karan. It's about the journey, even when the path is uncertain. Karan fell silent, his thoughts spinning. As he watched Alan care for the seeds, he realized that the storyteller's calm wasn't born from certainty, but from acceptance. Alan wasn't free from worry because he had control over life. He was free because he had let go of the need to control it. That evening, as Karun returned to his home, he opened his ledger to plan for the next day. But instead of diving into the usual flurry of calculations, he paused. He set the pen down, walked outside, and looked up at the stars. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to simply be. And in that moment, the weight of tomorrow lifted, replaced by the quiet peace of the present.
The cherry tree had become a sanctuary where villagers gathered to reflect and share their burdens. One morning, an elderly man named Saro arrived. His hands bore the marks of a lifetime of labor, and his eyes were heavy with regret. Saro sat beside Alan, speaking softly. "I've spent my life clinging to mistakes and hurts, both given and received. My heart feels weighed down like a sack of stones. How do I let it go?" Alan listened patiently, then stood, gesturing for Saro to follow. They walked to the river, its waters murmuring over smooth stones. Alan handed Saro a large rock. "Carry this for a while," Alan said. Saro frowned, but obeyed, the weight pressing into his hands. They walked along the riverbank until Saro stopped, exhausted. "I can't carry this anymore," he said, setting it down. Alan smiled gently. "And yet, you've carried such stones in your heart for years. The past only weighs us down when we refuse to let it go." Saro looked at the rock, understanding dawning. "The past teaches us, but it's not meant to be a burden," Alan added. "Letting go doesn't erase it. It sets you free to live fully now." Saro nodded, breathing deeply, as if the river itself was washing away his pain. From then on, he began to let go of his stones, one by one, making space for peace and joy in his heart.
Chapter 5. The Dance of Solitude. It was a quiet morning when a young artist named Lena visited Alan. Her hands, usually smeared with paint, were bare, and her eyes held a sadness she couldn't hide. She sat under the cherry tree, avoiding Alan's gaze. "I've lost my inspiration," Lena confessed after a long silence. "The joy I used to feel while painting has vanished. I've tried everything, new colors, new subjects, even different tools, but nothing works. I feel empty." Alan listened patiently. "Tell me, Lena, when was the last time you sat alone? Not to work or plan, but simply to be?" Lena frowned. "I'm always alone when I paint." Alan shook his head gently. "That's not the kind of solitude I mean. I'm talking about a solitude where you leave behind not just people, but also your expectations, your judgments, even your need to create." Lena tilted her head, confused. "How can that help me find my inspiration?" Alan smiled. "Come with me." He led her to a small meadow, far from the village. The grass swayed in the breeze, and the air was filled with the scent of wildflowers. "Sit here," Alan said, "and do nothing. Don't think about painting or anything else. Just watch, listen, and feel. Stay until the sun begins to set." Lena hesitated, but she did as he asked. At first her thoughts raced, tumbling over one another in a relentless stream. She worried about wasting time, about what others might think, about her unfinished work. But as the hours passed, her mind began to quiet. She noticed the way the light danced on the petals of the flowers, the hum of bees as they moved from bloom to bloom, the warmth of the sun on her skin. By the time the sky turned golden, Lena felt something shift within her. She didn't just see the world around her. She felt it, as if it were alive and speaking to her in a language she had forgotten how to hear. When she returned to the village, she picked up her brushes for the first time in weeks. The colors on her canvas seemed to flow effortlessly, capturing not just the appearance of the meadow, but the essence of the stillness she had experienced. Alan smiled when he saw her work. "Inspiration doesn't come from forcing yourself to create," he said. "It comes when you make space for it, when you let go of your need to control and allow life to speak to you in its own way." Chapter 6. The Gift of Imperfection. One evening, as the village prepared for a festival, a blacksmith named Oren sought out Alan. Oren was known for his skill and precision, but also for his harsh self-criticism. He sat down heavily, his face etched with frustration. "Alan," he began, "no matter how hard I try, I can't make my work perfect. There's always a flaw, something I wish I'd done differently. It eats at me, this feeling that I'll never be good enough." Alan looked at Oren thoughtfully. "Do you know the story of the cracked vase?" he asked. Oren shook his head. "There was once a potter," Alan began, "who made the most beautiful vases in the land. One day, he noticed a crack in one of his creations. At first, he was devastated, thinking the vase was ruined. But as he stared at the crack, he had an idea. He filled it with gold, letting the flaw become part of the design. The vase, once ordinary, became extraordinary, not despite the crack, but because of it." Oren frowned. "But I'm not a potter. I don't see how my mistakes could ever be beautiful." Alan smiled. "Perfection isn't about the absence of flaws, Oren. It's about embracing them, learning from them, and letting them shape your work and yourself. Our imperfections are what make us human. They tell a story, one that's far more meaningful than anything flawless ever could." Oren sat in silence, Alan's words settling over him like a gentle rain. That night, as he worked at his forge, he noticed something he hadn't before: the subtle beauty in the uneven edges of his metalwork, the way each piece carried its own character, its own soul. For the first time, he allowed himself to see his work not as a failure, but as a reflection of his journey. Chapter 7. The Courage to Say No. In the midst of the harvest season, a farmer named Dara approached Alan. Her hands were rough from years of labor, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. "I don't know how to stop," Dara said, her voice heavy. "People depend on me. Every time someone asks for my help, I say yes, even when I'm too tired to stand. How can I refuse when they need me?" Alan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Dara," he said, "imagine you're carrying a bucket of water. If you keep giving water to everyone who asks, without refilling the bucket, what will happen?" "It'll run dry," Dara said softly. "And what good is an empty bucket?" Alan asked gently. "Saying no isn't selfish. It's necessary. You cannot pour from an empty cup. By taking care of yourself, you ensure that you have the strength to truly help others when it matters most." Dara's eyes filled with tears. She had spent so long putting others first that she had forgotten to care for herself. From that day forward, she began to set boundaries, learning that sometimes saying no was the most compassionate choice she could make. Chapter 8. The Mirror of the Moon. One cool evening, as the moon hung low over the village, a boy named Arin came to Alan. Arin was young but troubled, his heart burdened by anger. He sat by the cherry tree, his fists clenched. "Why do people hurt each other?" Arin asked, his voice trembling with frustration. "Why can't the world be kinder? I want to change it, but I'm too small, too powerless." Alan looked at Arin with a gentle smile. "Do you see the moon tonight?" he asked. Arin glanced up at the glowing orb reflected in a nearby pond. "Yes, what about it?" The moon doesn't shine on its own, Alan said. It reflects the light of the sun. But see how its light touches everything. The trees, the water, even us, without asking for anything in return. It's not powerful because it forces change. It's powerful because it simply is. Aaron frowned, unsure of what Alan meant. If you wish to change the world, start by being the light you want to see, Alan continued. When you choose kindness, you reflect that kindness to others. Like the moon, you may not see how far your light travels, but it will reach places you can't imagine. Aaron sat quietly, watching the moonlight ripple across the pond. For the first time, his anger began to fade, replaced by a small but steady resolve. He didn't need to fix the world all at once. He could start with himself. Chapter 9. The Strength in Surrender. A traveler named Kyle arrived in the village one day, weary from his long journey. He carried with him tales of battles fought and victories won, but his eyes betrayed a deep exhaustion. "I've spent my whole life fighting," Kyle told Alan, "for survival, for honor, for everything I thought mattered. But now I feel empty. What is the point of all this struggle if it only leaves me tired and broken?" Alan nodded, his gaze calm. "Let me show you something." He led Kyle to the riverbank, where the water flowed steadily around a large rock. "Look at how the river moves," Alan said. "It doesn't try to push the rock away or fight against it. Instead, it flows around it, adapting to its presence." Kyle frowned. "But what does that have to do with me?" "The river is strong not because it fights, but because it surrenders to the obstacles in its path," Alan explained. "It embraces them, lets them become part of its journey, and in doing so, it carves its way forward. Sometimes, the greatest strength lies not in resisting, but in accepting." Kyle stood in silence, the weight of Alan's words sinking in. That night, as he rested under the stars, he let go of the battles he no longer needed to fight. And in their place, he found a peace he had never known.
Chapter 10. The Power of Small Moment. A baker named Lynn came to Alan one morning, her hands dusted with flour. She was known for her warm smile and her delicious bread, but lately she had felt overwhelmed by the monotony of her days. "Every day feels the same," Lynn said. "I wake up, bake bread, sell it, and then do it all again. I feel like I'm missing something, but I don't know what." Alan handed her a cup of tea and gestured for her to sit. "Lynn," he said, "when you bake your bread, do you think about the joy it brings to others? The comfort it offers to a tired farmer, or the delight it brings to a child?" Lynn shook her head. "I never thought about it that way. I just bake because it's what I've always done." Alan smiled. "Life isn't made up of grand gestures or extraordinary moments. It's built on the small, quiet acts of love and care we perform every day. Your bread may seem ordinary to you, but to someone else, it's a gift." Lynn stared at her hands, the flour still clinging to her fingers. She realized that in her quest for meaning, she had overlooked the beauty and the simplicity of her work. The next morning, as she kneaded the dough, she did so with a newfound gratitude, savoring each moment as it came. Chapter 11. The Pathless Path. A scholar named Idris visited Alan, frustrated by his inability to find answers to the questions that plagued him. "I've read every book I could find," Idris said. "I've studied philosophy, science, and religion, but I still feel lost. Where is the truth I seek?" Alan listened carefully, then asked, "Have you ever walked through a forest, Idris?" "Of course," Idris replied, puzzled. "And did you follow a path, or did you wander freely?" "I followed a path," Idris said. "It's easier to find your way when you have a guide." Alan nodded. "But sometimes the most profound truths aren't found on the path others have laid. They're discovered when you dare to wander, to lose yourself in the unknown. Truth isn't something you find, it's something you uncover within yourself." Idris frowned, uncertain. But as he left Alan that day, he began to wonder if perhaps he had been looking for answers in the wrong places. Instead of seeking knowledge, he resolved to seek understanding, and in doing so, he found a new kind of clarity.